This is like a palate cleanser story for the day. This is a crazy, crazy story. But here's a question for you. Did the United States land on the moon? Just drop it in the comment right now. Just let us know in the comments field here. Did the United States land on the moon? I already see hundreds of people saying no. Okay, just let us know your thoughts on this. Seems like an easy thing to prove, right? We know the landing site. We know exactly where they apparently landed, right? Show us the landing sites. Show us the evidence. And yet the former head of Russia's space agency and certain Russian academics can't seem to find any evidence at all that the United States actually landed on the moon. Oh boy, this story is going to piss off a lot of people. So here's the guy by the name of Dmitry Rogozin. There he is. That's Dmitry. And he worked at Russia's version of NASA. Not only did he work there, he ran it. He's like the Bill Nelson of Russia, running NASA. So Dmitry was the head of Russia's space agency. He later became the prime minister of defense and ambassador to NATO. He has a degree in journalism, so he knows how to ask questions, pertinent questions, and a degree in economics, a graduate degree in economics. His parents were scientists, and he's not afraid to ask actual questions, as good scientists do. Well, he just posted something on his Telegram channel. He has almost 90,000 subscribers on his Telegram channel. And I've gotten the translated version of it from Russian, but he posted it, and it's very fascinating. So here's his Telegram channel, and it's Rogozin at the front. That's what he calls his Telegram channel. And he says he admitted that about 10 years ago, while he was the head of the agency, he went on a bit of a spirit quest. He was trying to understand something that didn't make a lot of sense to him. You see, he was trying to understand how Soviet cosmonauts did multi-day expeditions in order to land on the moon, but when they returned, they could barely stand on their feet at all, almost like they were handicapped. They had to undergo very long recovery times. And he couldn't understand then how the Americans emerged from the lunar modules, looking like they had just stayed at the Four Seasons.
Because they're Nephilims.
It didn't make any sense to him. It didn't make any sense to him that they were they came back refreshed. You know, when they landed in those modules and they got out and they looked all refreshed.
You know the theory of Nephilims from the Bible, like the angels came down and made superhumans, basically.
Yeah.
So it could be that.
Maybe it could be. So he started asking some questions like, why would, you see the videos of these guys landing on the moon, right? You see these videos of them, the lunar modules landing in the ocean, and they get out and they looked like, they had just stayed at a Four Seasons. Like they're all refreshed. It didn't make any sense to him. So he started asking some tough questions at the space agency.
Four Season moon.
Yeah. So he started asking some tough questions at the space agency that he was in charge of. He wanted to know where the evidence was that the Apollo 11 moon mission ever reached the lunar surface. Surely, we have, as a competing space agency, we would have overwhelming evidence. We would have photographs of the landing sites, right? You would absolutely have that. You would know with pinpoint accuracy where the Americans had landed. Materials, scientific reports, all of it. We were in a Cold War with these guys. They would know every movement. And sorts of studies. How did the Americans do this? And yet he found nothing at the space agency. Nothing. I'm going to quote him now. This is Dmitry. About 10 years ago, when I worked in government, I sent an official request to the Roscosmos, which is their version of NASA, to provide me with documentary evidence of the Americans' stay on the moon. They were there for days, right? Which at the time was still at the disposal of the federal agency, he says. He continues, I was painfully embarrassed by the fact that the Soviet cosmonauts returning from multi-day expeditions could barely stand on their feet and underwent a long recovery after such flights. And the Americans crawled out of their lunar ships like cucumbers from the garden, he says. He kept pushing his government, give me the evidence that the Americans landed on the moon. And finally, he got a response from a Russian cosmonaut who basically told him to go pound sand for even asking the question. And he sent him a book. He sent him a book called Conquest of the Moon with a comment written by the cosmonaut Leonov that he said the Americans were there because they told him themselves that they were there. That's literally the only evidence he received. That a cosmonaut says they were there because an American told me they were there. Okay. So the only evidence he got from a cosmonaut was from an American who spoke to him. Yeah, we were on the moon. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, great. So this guy, the former head of the space agency, didn't give up. He says he continued to search for this evidence, but he found nothing. The only thing he got was anger from within his own space agency because of the relationship with NASA. They had a good relationship with NASA. And they didn't want it to be compromised. They told him to drop it, basically, and that he would, quote, aggravate an international situation. So shut up. Don't ask questions. Don't ask anything. But he didn't stop there. He then started asking Russian academics about it, who were in the know, and they all but stonewalled him. We know this is true because in November 2018, academic E.B. Elektronov from the Russian Academy of Sciences gave a really weird interview on Russian radio called Moscow Speaks radio show. And he admitted that, yes, Dmitry did ask him for evidence that the Americans had landed on the moon. So he confirmed the story. And he was put off by the question he described in the interview. And he admits this on radio. There he is. That was the academic who was put off by this. That how dare you ask me this question? And he said basically he was asked, Dmitry then confirmed, he wanted him to show him the landing sites. Because clearly you're part of this. You're an academic who worked at the agency. You know where these landing sites are. You have the materials, the evidence, the studies, all of it. And he said he wouldn't look. He wouldn't look. And the reason he wouldn't look, according to this author, and you can speculate, but according to this author of this piece, says that they would find virginal sites. Nothing there. No evidence that the Americans had landed in those sites at all. If they examined them, there wouldn't be debris. There wouldn't be boxes left over. There wouldn't be a rover that they left behind. There wouldn't be golf clubs. There wouldn't be anything that they purported to have landed there with.
MTV flag?
Yeah, the MTV flag. That wasn't there. But the American flag, like they would be able to find this stuff easily. But he said he was told, no, don't ask questions. Stop asking questions. I think this is an amazing story. So what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments below. What do you think about this head of the Russian space agency saying, I would just love to see some evidence of it. I'm just asking a simple scientific question. How are our cosmonauts coming back from these missions?
Think of a long-term base in space and everyone thinks of the International Space Station, which has been the longest and most successful space program so far. But the hard-earned lessons that have kept the ISS continuously manned for over 20 years came from one of our very first attempts to live in space longer than just a few weeks, with America's first orbiting space workshop, Skylab. However, Skylab became known more for the things that went wrong than the things that went right. Problems that started just minutes into its launch and then years later, just before it burned up. This is the story of Skylab and why it's probably one of the most important space missions we've ever done. This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Apollo was a great success for both the US and humanity to take the huge leap from orbiting the Earth for a few days to visiting our nearest celestial neighbour. Now, whilst we had shown we could get to and land a man on the moon, the total amount of time we'd spent in space on each Apollo mission was still very short. The longest mission, Apollo 17, spent just 3 days on the surface and just 9 days travelling in space. The talk at the time was that this could be the springboard to visiting other planets, in particular Mars. Whilst the Moon is 384,000 kilometres away and about 3 days travelling time, to get to Mars takes about 7 months one way and about the same again back. We had no idea of what living in the weightless conditions of space for well over a year would do to the human body, or if it could be done at all. Well before we ever got into space, the use of a space station as a staging post for a trip to Mars had been discussed by Wernher von Braun in his 1952 book Project Mars, and up until the 1960s it was thought that a space station of some sort would be an important early step in space exploration. However, the politics of the Cold War dictated that the US should beat the Soviets to the moon by the end of the decade, and the idea of a dedicated space station was put to one side. Although the US may have won the race to the moon, the Soviets were the first to put a space station into orbit with the ill-fated Salyut 1 in 1971. However, it had to be abandoned by Soyuz 11 crew after just 23 days due to problems including a fire, and the crew were sadly killed by asphyxia whilst returning to Earth when a valve in their Soyuz capsule failed, and they remain the only people so far to have died in space. Back in the US, Wernher von Braun, who had started out in the 1950s with the idea of a large rotating space station like we see in the film 2001, had already worked out plans that would become part of the Apollo applications program to convert the second stage fuel tank of a Saturn rocket into an orbital workshop. And with the cancellation of the later Apollo missions 18, 19 and 20, it freed up the now spare Saturns to create Skylab and also use the Apollo command and service modules to transport the crew to and from it. Skylab would fill in the gap between Apollo and the space shuttle, which was due in 1979. It would not only be a laboratory to find out how living in space would affect the human body, it would also carry the Apollo telescope mount and solar observatory to study the sun in greater detail than ever before in both the ultraviolet and X-ray spectrums outside of the Earth's atmosphere, something that would become prescient of Skylab's ultimate fate in 1979. Skylab was launched on May 14, 1973, to be followed by the crew on another launch the next day. But almost immediately it ran into problems when a micrometeorite shield and sunshade accidentally deployed during the launch, which was immediately ripped off by the slipstream as it travelled at several thousand kilometres per hour. Once in orbit and within an hour of the launch, more problems became apparent. With no heat shield, the temperature of the workshop was rising dramatically, and a pair of solar arrays were not functioning correctly, which later turned out that one had been pulled off by the departing sunshade. NASA was now into a repair mission and had to delay the next day crew launch whilst they figured out if and how it was possible to fix the problems and save Skylab. Over the next 10 days, teams around the US worked day and night to come up with a solution to fix the missing solar shield. The idea was to make a parasol that would be attached to the side of a workshop and then open it up to provide the shade required. As this was being done, the backup crew practiced the operations in the Skylab underwater simulator to both fit the parasol and also fix the solar array. 10 days later, the crew mission of Skylab 2 lifted off to try and rescue the $2.5 billion program. If they couldn't fix the problems, then it would spell the end of Skylab. Nothing like this had been done before. On the Apollo 13 mission, the crew had managed to jerry-rig CO2 scrubbers together with what they could find around the command module. On the Skylab mission, they would be working in space, and although they had an idea of what was wrong, they wouldn't know exactly until they got there. Once the crew arrived and on a televised fly-around, they confirmed that the solar shield was indeed gone, as well as one of the solar arrays, and the other was jammed by a strap, which was part of the now missing solar shield. The crew managed to fix the parasol in place and release the stuck solar array, bringing the temperature down in the workshop to acceptable levels and providing enough power for the mission to continue. NASA had learned that it was possible to work in space and fix problems that relied upon the crew's initiative, something that would prove invaluable for future missions, not only in assembling the ISS but also fixing the Hubble Space Telescope, another multi-billion-dollar program that had to be fixed in space. Once Skylab was functioning, it could carry on its work, but it was hardly what you would call luxurious. It was basically a giant aluminium can in which the crew would eat, sleep and work, with one window, onboard excrement store and somewhat bland food. This large open space did allow them to do things that are not possible now on the ISS, such as running around the wall and doing acrobatics. One of the things they discovered was if someone was spun around in a chair, then they would not get dizzy like they would doing the same here on Earth. This showed that the inner ear relied on gravity to work. Hundreds of experiments were carried out over the 3 missions on everything from exercise in space to Earth resources, looking down at the Earth, to material sciences like welding in space and growing crystals. Each of the 3 crewed missions stretched the limit of human spaceflight endurance, with Skylab 2 lasting 28 days, Skylab 3 56 days, and Skylab 4 for 84 days. For the first time, we had a place to conduct experiments into all aspects of living in space for longer periods of time, not only into how it affects the human body, but how we could work in microgravity and how it affects materials and processing of things that will be needed, like growing plants for food. There were also student-requested experiments like bringing spiders on board to see if they could build their webs in zero gravity. In fact, it only took them a day or so to go from making a chaotic mess of a web to making one that looked pretty much like they did here on Earth. One astronaut commented that they adapted to zero gravity old humans and without the months of training. Skylab had enough oxygen, food and water to last 24 man-months, though in the end they only used 16 months of the supplies. Before departing for the last time, the Skylab 4 crew left food and provisions for the next crew, which never happened, and left the hatch unlocked. They also used the Apollo command and service module to boost the orbit by 11 kilometers and leave it in a parking orbit. It was known that without further booster operations, Skylab would eventually fall back to Earth, but this was not expected to occur until about 1983, and the space shuttle was due to come into service in 1979 to boost Skylab's orbit. To do this, the Teleoperator Retrieval System, or TRS, was ordered by NASA in 1977 for use in late 1979. This was a remotely controlled space tug that was designed to move payloads around in space and boost or deorbit spacecraft or satellites. The idea was that this space lab could be saved, it could be used as the core of a new, larger space station. But despite having the world's best sun observatory on Skylab, NASA ignored warnings in 1973 by the British mathematician Desmond King Helley of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the RAE, that it would return in 1979, and again by NORAD in 1977, who revised their date to mid-1979 due to the effect of the largest increase in solar activity in a century. Basically, with more energy coming from the sun, the more the Earth's upper atmosphere heated up, and this expanded outwards, causing slightly more drag on Skylab. This would cause it to slow down, only very slightly, but enough to lower its orbit more quickly than expected, and instead of deorbiting in 1983, it was now going to be sometime in 1979. Problems with the space shuttle meant that it was going to be delayed and would not be available to take the TRS to boost Skylab's orbit, so the TRS was cancelled. The TRS could have been launched on a Titan or Atlas Agena and controlled from Earth, but the idea was dropped as budgets were cut and Skylab was left to a fiery fate a few years later. The debacle that was Skylab returning to Earth also showed that NASA needed to learn lessons on how to predict and handle the return of a large piece of what was now space debris. There was a plan to have fuel on board Skylab to allow it to have a more controlled re-entry, but that was later dropped because of the fear that it might cause danger to the crews on board. This left NASA with less control of where it would eventually end up on Earth. As the time approached, this caused a media frenzy as people who were under Skylab's flight path were concerned that it might fall on them. Just a few hours before the event, NASA adjusted Skylab's orientation to take it on a path that would fly across the US and drop it into the southern Atlantic, about 1,300 kilometers south-southeast of Cape Town, South Africa, to avoid flying over the more densely populated areas of Europe and onto China. However, due to a 4% margin of error in the calculations, and that the main part of Skylab took much longer to burn up than expected, it carried along its flight path and over the southern Indian Ocean where parts of it fell, but some continued on towards southwestern Australia, where they fell over an area stretching from the town of Esperance on the coast to Rowena, some 300 kilometres in a northeasterly direction. Many pieces were found by local people, with some saying that NASA had planned to land it there rather than over the US because it was more sparsely populated. But in reality, you could see that it was just at the end of its flight path, and that if it had been controlled more accurately with onboard fuel, it could have been dropped into the ocean quite easily. Although it was fraught with problems, NASA was able to make good on what could have been an expensive and humiliating failure and apply what it learned to future missions. If Skylab had been lost just after its launch, it would have set us back years, and even with the Space Shuttle's extended duration orbiter program, which was never fully utilised for month-long durations, it still wouldn't have compared to the 510 man-days which were spent on Skylab. The knowledge gained through NASA was open to everyone in the world, and soon the Soviets would use it to help them build a succession of new Salyut and Mir space stations, culminating in the Zvezda, which became part of the core of the Russian part of the ISS. This, along with modules from the US, Europe and Japan, forms the basis of the ISS, and what we know about individuals continuously living in space for almost 2.5 years, which will be invaluable for travelling to Mars in the not too distant future, and which is why it could be said that Skylab is probably one of the most influential space programs so far. NASA learned many things from Skylab. One of them was the feasibility of doing an EVA to fix mission-level failures. Before they launched, they had a list of situations that they thought were no-goes, and one of them was doing an EVA down the side of a module to fix something like a solar array. But the problem they saw at Mission Control was that the array was working, but just not deploying. They thought that it might be possible to fix the issue with some specially adapted tools. So they took a calculated risk, and with those tools, it was possible to do the EVA and release the stuck solar array. This process of fixing a problem that you think isn't possible is the same as when you're learning a new skill. And the sponsor of this video, Brilliant, can help you do just that. Brilliant is These are some of the iconic pieces of launch footage from the space race and the shuttle program. Shots taken that would be impossible for any human to see close up and personal. And many of them were done long before we had miniature high-definition cameras and high-speed data links beaming the footage live from space. So how did NASA film these incredible shots of Apollo, the space shuttle and beyond? Now, as good as these look from an aesthetic point of view, they weren't done just to wow the public. They had a very important engineering role, and that was their primary purpose: to show the engineers and scientists just what was going on at critical stages of the launch, and in some cases like the Shuttle, Challenger and Columbia disasters, they were key in finding out exactly what happened. The story of how these techniques were developed goes back to the very first long-range ballistic missile, the V-2. The world's first CCTV system was developed by Walter Brausch in order to observe the rocket launches from a safe distance in a bunker. At the time, there was no way to record the video footage, so cameramen had to stand within the walled test area to film the launches, an extremely dangerous place to be so close to prototype rockets. Major General Dr. Walter Dornberg, of a V2 project leader, recalled how on one V2 test, the rocket launched but then stalled and hovered about 4 meters above the launch table, something that normally preceded it falling back and exploding. About 100 meters from the rocket and next to the test area earth wall, a cameraman was filming it with a hand-cranked camera. After about 5 seconds, the rocket started to rise as its fuel was depleted and it became lighter. It gradually rose up, remaining vertical and slowly travelling sideways towards the cameraman, who continued filming till it passed almost directly overhead, at which point he then stopped filming and ducked down. The rocket exploded a split second later and crashed about 40 meters beyond the test area wall. A remarkable feat of bravery on behalf of the cameraman, who survived unscathed. When the US took the surviving stock of around 100 V2s to the White Sands missile range in New Mexico after the war, they needed a way to observe and record their test flights in greater detail and safety than was done before. In 1946, Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer who first discovered Pluto 16 years earlier, was invited to come to White Sands to help improve the optical instruments tracking of the rockets. Tombaugh's team built their tracking system on a World War II M45 quad-mount anti-aircraft platform, affectionately known as Little Bright Eyes. This was because of the binoculars the operator used to manually guide the field of view along the flight path, which were fitted between the 5 and 6-inch refractor telescopes attached to two 35mm cameras which had replaced the 50 caliber guns. But it wasn't only ground cameras that were of importance. In 1946, Clyde Holliday, an engineer working on the V2 program, modified a 35mm movie camera to withstand the shock of the launch and the impact when it came back to Earth. On October 24, 1946, the camera, which used Eastman Kodak Super XX film running at 4 frames per second, was mounted into an aluminium case with 10mm thick walls and into the body of a V2 rocket, and then launched to a height of 107 kilometers. This was the first time that anyone had seen the Earth from the edge of space. From here, they could clearly see 1,200 kilometers in all directions, an area the equivalent of 4.1 million square kilometers, and they could clearly see the curvature of the Earth. The M45 platform was used on 3 further tracking mounts at the White Sands range, and some of the T4 systems are still in use today. But as America went from testing small ballistic missiles to the mighty Saturn V, a huge array of different cameras became necessary to check the complex systems during launch. At the John F. Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the concrete launch pad at Complex 39A was riddled with fixed high-speed cameras, able to record onto 16mm film at 500 frames per second. By the time of Apollo 11, there were 201 cameras recording the launch, 119 for engineering and 82 for documentary purposes. This footage is from camera E8, which was housed within the concrete pad itself, out of line of sight of the engines and pointed at a heat-resistant mirror made of quartz glass to avoid being destroyed at liftoff. Above the pad, similar high frame rate cameras on gantries filmed the rocket's clean separation from the umbilical connections. As the Saturn V cleared the tower, the ascent was broadcast to a live TV audience worldwide, from a camera on a mount descended from Tombaugh's Bright Eyes. From the mid-1960s, purpose-built tracking mounts were made by companies like Photosonics. Their Cine Sextant optical tracking mount held twin telescopes on powerful motorized pedestals, allowing heavier optics to track the launch at greater ranges. This footage from Apollo 4 shows the first stage separation at a height of 65 kilometers, 211,000 feet, and was captured by a camera on the ground. But even with powerful telescopes like this, they couldn't see the detail of what was happening in the rocket itself. To see this, cameras were fitted into the Saturn rocket stages to film the stage separations. In fact, the now iconic separation footage seen here was from cameras mounted in the base of the second stage, and is often shown as part of Apollo 11 footage, but is actually from Apollo 4. these cameras weren't used on Apollo 11 due to lack of space available. Apollo 4 was the first unmanned test of a full Saturn V rocket, and many things still remained unknown about how it would react during the launch. The engineers wanted to see that the stages separated cleanly and that the interstage structures, that's the smaller ring-like object here, didn't hit the engines during separation, as the clearances were very tight. The J2 engines seen in the top of the frame are firing, although the hot exhaust plume is invisible in the vacuum of space, but its effect can be seen on the interstage section as it falls away. On Apollo 6 there were 6 film cameras and 2 TV cameras. The film cameras ran at 100 frames per second and were fitted into pods that were ejected from the stage shortly after the separation, as you can see here. These would fall back to Earth, and once they were in the lower atmosphere, they would inflate paraballoons to slow the landing into the sea and allow them to float. There was also a radio beacon which was activated and allowed them to be found in the Atlantic Ocean, normally around about 600 miles downrange. But not all the pods were recovered. On Apollo 6, only 2 of the 6 were found, and in 1964, on mission SA-7, they ended up being ejected into Hurricane Gladys as it made its way across the Atlantic. However, 7 weeks later, 2 of them were washed up undamaged on the islands of San Salvador and Eleuthera. Whilst some of the cameras filmed the subject directly, others were the first to use fibre optics to remotely place the lenses away from the actual cameras to film places that would be otherwise inaccessible, like this, the inside of the fuel tanks, to see how the fuel reacted in low gravity and how much it sloshed around during the launch, something that could seriously affect the rocket's guidance if it was not controlled. A decade later, the tracking mounts again had to catch up with the broadcast of the first flight of the American Space Shuttle Columbia. When the shuttle launched on the 12th of April 1981, the stakes were high, to broadcast the launch to a TV audience who were now more than ever watching in full colour. A government contract was awarded to the private company Contraves to deliver a new mobile optical platform, which they called the Kineto Tracking Mount, or KTM. Like the Photosonic platform, these retained the recognisable format of the M45 mount. However, they could either be manned or set up for remote operation within the launch exclusion zone. Although the new robotic mounts were greeted with suspicion by the camera operators at the Kennedy Space Center, 10 mobile KTMs were positioned around the launch center. Short-range optics on these mounts filmed from T-10 seconds to T+57 seconds, with longer ranging until T+165 seconds. This piece of footage here of the shuttle Discovery at T+40 seconds is shot from a medium-distance camera about 3.8 kilometers from the launch pad using a 150-inch lens with a 4,000mm focal length as the shuttle is accelerating through 20,000 feet. As Discovery goes through 145,000 feet at 123 seconds into the flight, the boosters separate, which is captured here by another 150-inch 4,000mm focal length lens on a KTM. The weight of the lens alone on these was about 115 kilos, and the tracking to keep the Discovery in the frame was done by a human and not an automated system. After 3 minutes, the job of filming the ascent was transferred to the largest telescope on the site, the permanently mounted 24-inch aperture recording optical tracking instrument, or ROTI. With a focal length of up to 12,700mm, ROTI had enough magnification to follow the launch for up to 5 minutes after liftoff. ROTI used both radar-assisted tracking and a joystick for manual adjustment, which had such a fine sensitivity that it could register the heartbeat of the user if held too firmly. During the early shuttle launches, over 130 cameras were used to record all aspects of the launch, combining 16mm, 35mm and 70mm film formats, as well as high-definition video. Film was used even after the advent of video because of its high resolution and much wider dynamic range. That's its ability to keep very bright and normally lit objects in the same scene without them being washed out. The video was used for quick access to footage whilst the film was being processed. The high-speed film cameras were placed in explosion-proof boxes close to the launch pad to record different aspects of a flight. Here is camera E19. It's running at 400 frames per second with a 10mm wide-angle lens and recording the engine startup and flame pattern. The cameras were fitted with automatic exposure control to allow them to film the exhaust plume that from the solid rocket boosters looks as bright as the sun. You can see how wide the dynamic range this gives and how well it works when combined with film. As in this shot you have the super bright SRB exhaust with the blue sky behind it, and both are perfectly exposed. This shot is actually recording the operation of the explosive hold down bolts, 4 of which held down each of the SRBs to the mobile launch pad until the point of liftoff. Another great shot is that of the tail service mount disconnect from camera E18. There was one of these on each side of the shuttle, one for the liquid hydrogen and one for the liquid oxygen. Again, the 16mm camera used a 10mm lens and was running at 400 frames per second, as were most of the engineering cameras on the mobile launch pad. What's not easily apparent from this shot is the size of the connector. Each one was 1.2 meters wide by 1.8 meters high. That's bigger than most house doors. They were pulled in with a force of 9,000 kilograms before the protective blast doors dropped down. One of the biggest challenges was that once the door was shut, it was pitch black inside, so they had to be lit by tungsten lamps. But the vibration was so strong that it would blow the filaments in the lamps. So on the latest missions, LED lighting is now used instead. Cameras were also vital to the investigation of the Challenger and Columbia disasters. As the Space Shuttle Challenger rose into the sky on the icy morning of January 28, 1986, the high frame rate cameras on the launch tower filmed a puff of grey smoke escaping from the side of the right solid rocket booster. But by the time the pictures were examined, it was far too late. 17% of all Americans were watching, including millions of school children, as Challenger broke up 73 seconds after launch. Broadcast live, the footage of STS-51L remains among the most unforgettable and tragic of the space program. During the investigation of the disaster, footage from NASA's tracking cameras was essential to identifying the sequence of events during Challenger's last flight. With the rotor's high magnification, the burst of superheated gas from the SRB can be seen, and during the explosion, the individual elements of the orbiter can be identified, including the crew cabin, which was designed to survive much greater pressures than the fuselage and was only destroyed on impact with the ocean surface below. Such tragic accidents led to wider use of cameras for each launch, with the number of KTMs increasing to 14 following the Columbia shuttle disaster in 2003. With the return to flight in 2005, STS-114 had over 400 cameras monitoring the launch. On this launch, Rocket Cam would be used for the second time. This is a camera system that is fitted to the outside of the SRBs and the main fuel tank. At about 127 seconds into the flight, a large piece of debris about 92 centimeters by 27 centimeters was caught by Rocket Cam falling from the main fuel tank, but luckily not hitting anything. 20 seconds later, another smaller piece hit the right wing, but after checking with the orbiter boom sensor system, it was found not to have caused any damage. Rocket Cam is now used on most launches and is responsible for the amazing external footage of things like booster separations and the landing of the SpaceX reusable rockets. The return to flight also used high-definition cameras aboard the B-57 Canberra aircraft at an altitude of 60,000 feet, over 18 kilometers. The WB-57 Ascent video experiment was able to film the shuttle even in overcast weather, tracking the launch over a 643-kilometer path into space. So what's your favourite piece of launch footage? Let me know in the comments below, and maybe you're one of the amateur rocket observers or one of the workers at the Kennedy Space Center.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
It's probably the most well-known peacetime battle between the United States and the Soviet Union in both technological and ideological terms of the 20th century. And although the USA won the race to the moon, if you'd been a betting person from the mid-1950s to the 1960s, the chances are that you would have thought that the Soviet Union would have a very good chance of getting there first. So why didn't Russia put a man on the moon? At the time, the Soviets were leading in the space race. They had already started with the launch of Sputnik, then launched several probes to the moon, including one in 1959 that orbited and had taken photos of the far side, and by 1961 they'd put the first man into space. So when Kennedy made his now famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech in 1962 to rally public support, the Soviet leader Khrushchev's response was silence, neither confirming nor denying that they had a plan for manned moon missions. But at the time, Khrushchev wasn't really interested in competing with the US over the moon. He was more interested in ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles for the strategic rocket forces of the Soviet Union. But there were others in the Soviet Union that had harboured plans for a manned moon mission for a long time. These included the man whose name was a state secret and the most powerful man outside of the Kremlin when it came to space. He was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Outside the inner circle of the top space scientists, he was known only as the chief designer, or by his first two initials SP, because the Soviet leadership feared that the Western powers would send agents to try and assassinate him. Korolev was the man who was behind many of the Soviet space successes and the head of the OKB-1 design bureau. He oversaw Sputnik and the manned missions, including the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. His authority extended over almost everything to do with space. His design group worked on missions to Mars and Venus, communications, spy and weather satellites, ICBMs, and the Soviet manned moon missions. Korolev had a huge amount of control over the space program. In administrative power, he was almost a one-man version of NASA, covering areas that in the US were done across multiple aerospace companies and flight centers. But even a man of his power and connections didn't get everything his own way. He had to continuously fight against rival designers and design groups. Although Korolev wanted the moon missions himself, in 1960 the job was given to his rival, Vladimir Chelomey, because of his patronage by Khrushchev, but his lack of experience meant that the missions progressed slowly. The progress of Apollo, on the other hand, worried the chief designers, and as a result of this and the infighting between the design bureaus meant that there were multiple overlapping designs for the moon missions. At one point, there were 30 different designs for launchers and spacecraft. In 1964, the Soviet leader Khrushchev was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. Korolev was given then complete control over the moon missions and pushed through his designs ahead of Chelomey's, and the decision finally to compete for the moon was given, with the aim to land in 1967, the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, and to get there before the Americans. This, however, created a problem for Korolev. In order to lift a payload weight of 95 tons, he needed a very large rocket. This new rocket would be called the N1, be as big as the American Saturn V, and would require new, large, powerful engines, similar to the F1 rocket engines used in the Saturn. Valentin Glushko was the leading rocket designer at the time and the head of the OKB 456 Bureau, which had a near monopoly when it came to rocket design and production. He specialised in making engines that used hypergolic propellants. These consist of a fuel and an oxidizer that, when mixed together, spontaneously ignite when they come into contact with each other. Korolev thought these were too dangerous for manned missions due to the highly toxic and corrosive nature of the chemicals used to make up the fuel. Glushko said that it was not possible to create a new large engine design that used cryogenic fuel of liquid oxygen and kerosene and get it ready in time with limited resources and cash. He also cited that at the time, the Americans had been working on cryogenic engines for the Saturn for 5 years and still hadn't got them to work reliably. There was also a personal problem between the two men. Korolev blamed Glushko for denouncing him in the Great Purge under Stalin in 1938, leading to Korolev's near death, serving 6 years in a Soviet labour camp. Glushko, on the other hand, considered Korolev to be irresponsibly cavalier and autocratic towards things which were outside of his zone of competence. This clash between them led to Glushko refusing to work for Korolev and caused delays to the overall program. Korolev was forced to find a new engine designer and gave the job to Nikolai Kuznetsov, who was a leading jet engine designer but had not designed a rocket engine before. The Kuznetsov Design Bureau looked at the problem and realised that creating a rocket engine was not that different to the jet engines they were used to. But they ran into the same problem as Glushko, in that the Soviets simply didn't have the industrial infrastructure that the Americans did to produce a new large engine. The solution they came up with was innovative, but would have both negative and positive outcomes. Where the Americans used 5 large engines for the initial booster stage of the Saturn, Korolev was forced to use 30 small but highly efficient engines arranged in a ring of 24 around the base and 6 at the centre. In order to achieve the thrust required, the design of these engines was very advanced and used a method called the closed cycle system. This was capable of boosting the efficiency and power to levels which were believed impossible before. The Americans had known about the closed cycle system, but thought it was too difficult and dangerous, as the high pressure, high temperature oxygen method could cause the engines to burn up. So they used the more reliable but less efficient open cycle system, but with much larger engines. It had only been possible for the Soviets to create a closed cycle engine because they had secretly developed advanced stainless steel alloys, something which the Americans didn't know about at the time. Using so many smaller engines allowed the N1 rocket to create more power than the Saturn, but the likelihood of one or more of them failing and making the rocket unstable was much greater. One of the main problems was the complex fuel plumbing that was required to supply all the engines, which in time proved to be a very fragile system. But just as the Soviets were working on the new engines, in 1966 Korolev died after undergoing a routine operation. This was a setback because Korolev had a unique set of abilities and connections and was the major driving force behind making sure that the moon missions would be delivered. The work of continuing fell to Vasily Mishkin, Korolev's deputy, but Mishkin didn't have the political astuteness or power of his old boss. The Soviets also didn't have the facilities to test all 30 of the engines of the main stage at once before they were mounted to the rocket. The Baikonur launch complex could also not be reached by heavy barges, so the whole rocket had to be broken down into sections, transported by rail, and then rebuilt again at the launch pad. This meant that the development of the N1 rocket as a whole was still ongoing when it came to the launches, so it was almost expected that there would be failures. The Soviets planned 14 launches. The first 12 would be unmanned, and the last 2 would lunar missions. On the 21st of February 1969, the first N1 rocket was prepared for launch. This would be the first time that the whole system had been tested. In fact, it was revealed later that only 2 out of every batch of 6 engines had even been run before the launch. This was in contrast to the Americans, which were fully able to test their F1 engines before the Saturn was assembled. Once that had been done, it was then moved from the assembly building to the launch pad nearby, fully assembled, tested and ready to go. Within seconds of the launch, the engine control system, which was called Cord, shut down 2 of the 30 Stage 1 engines. Then, self-oscillating vibrations started in the fuel system due to unstable combustion in some of the engines. This ruptured fuel lines, which caught fire and burned through electrical control wiring. This then caused the Cord system to incorrectly shut down all of the engines 68 seconds into the flight, and the rocket crashed 32 miles from the launch pad. After the investigation and subsequent modification, the second flight was due for the 3rd of July 1969. The launch took place at 11:18 p.m. As the rocket cleared the tower, the liquid oxygen turbo pump on engine number 8 exploded, causing a fire which triggered cord to shut down all the engines except one. The N1 fell back onto the launch pad with nearly 2,300 tons of rocket fuel on board. The resultant explosion was one of the largest ever to happen and was the equivalent of 3.8 kilotons of TNT, or a small nuclear bomb. It destroyed the launch complex, blasted debris over 6 miles away, and was visible over 22 miles away. Some 30 minutes after the blast, when launch crews were allowed onto the site, they found droplets of unburnt rocket fuel still raining down from the sky. And afterwards it was discovered that 85% of the rocket fuel did not detonate, which actually reduced the size of the blast. 17 days later, Neil Armstrong became the first man on the moon with the Apollo 11 mission, and although the race for the moon had been lost, the Soviets carried on. The blast caused a 2-year delay whilst the launch complex was rebuilt and further modifications were made to the rocket. In November of 1971, the third attempt also failed due to unexpected eddy and countercurrents in the base of the main stage, causing the rocket to roll uncontrollably and ultimately break up due to the stress on its structure. 1 year later, in November 1972, the fourth and final launch also failed 107 seconds into the flight after the program shutdown of the 6 center engines caused a hydraulic shockwave to rupture the fuel pipes and start a fire. The main stage then exploded shortly afterwards. Although there had been 4 previous launch failures, the Soviets had actually made huge progress, and the design by trial and error was believed to have ironed out all of the problems. But by the time of the 5th launch in August 1974, the whole moon mission was cancelled by Brezhnev. By this time, the Americans had been to the moon 6 times, and public interest in space was waning. One theory is that if the 5th launch had been successful, it would have forced the Soviets to carry on the moon mission, where the main goal of beating the USA had already been lost. The cancellation of the project was therefore a way of sweeping a very expensive undertaking under the carpet. Vasily Mishkin was ultimately fired and replaced by Glushko, but by 1976 the N1 rocket program was scrapped. The rockets were broken up to hide the failure and to make the US think that the space race was still ongoing. It wasn't until Gorbachev's period of glasnost when this cover story was blown and the true story of the failed Soviet moon mission became widely known about, and why the Russians didn't put a man on the moon. But there is a strange twist to the end of this story. The NK-43 rockets that had been developed for the N1 were, by the end, much more reliable and the most efficient and powerful rocket engines for their size ever made. 20 years after they were meant to have been destroyed on order of the Kremlin, 60 of them were rediscovered and sold to the Americans for $1.1 million each. A subsequent new, larger model, the RD-180, based on the technology of the NK-43, is now built by the Russians and used by the Americans for their Atlas V heavy launch vehicle.
In 1985, one of the most audacious space rescue missions was launched by the Soviets to recover a space station that had been dead for months due to an unknown fault. That feat was unparalleled in space exploration and rewrote the books on what was thought possible, and yet its story has fallen into obscurity and conspiracy theory. In 1979, the Soviet Union was a superpower in search of a space station. Mir, the state-of-the-art orbital facility, was in development but was delayed and still 6 years from launch. And also the military space station Almaz had also recently been cancelled without its final mission taking place. To maintain a presence in low Earth orbit, the Soviet Space Agency took the decision to fly one more single launch station. That's a small space station that can be lifted into orbit complete in one launch. The backup hardware for the Salyut program could be used, and a series of missions was planned for the station what would become known as Salyut 7. This small lab orbiting 200 kilometers or 120 miles above the Earth would go further than any spacecraft before to become the base for 6 long-term expeditions. But Salyut 7 would also suffer from a series of strange malfunctions and become the scene of a desperate rescue at orbital velocity. The space race of the 60s and 70s was measured by a growing number of competitive record-breaking missions. In the Soviet media, new achievements were needed to justify the expense of the space programs and bolster national pride. To feed this hunger, cosmonauts spent longer and longer in their capsules, on spacewalks, and then inhabiting manned space stations. The American Skylab, constructed from an adapted Saturn V upper stage, spent 84 days in orbit in 1973-74. testing the effects of microgravity on the body and pioneering solar observations. In 1978, the Soviet Salyut 6 exceeded the long-standing Skylab record when its crew passed 96 days in orbit, and by 1980, that record had been extended to 184 days of uninterrupted habitation. With the upcoming Mir, the Soviets planned to do more than had ever been possible with single launch stations. Salyut 7 could help make this a reality by testing out new hardware and training cosmonauts. As with its predecessors, Salyut 7 had the docking ports fore and aft, so crew rotation and resupply could happen simultaneously. Salyut had previously been supplied by the Progress spacecraft, a derivative of Soyuz that still travels to the International Space Station to this day. Salyut 7 launched aboard a Proton rocket on the 19th of April 1982, and on May the 13th, the first crew launched to rendezvous with it, beginning a mission that would last for a record-breaking 211 days. The first task aboard the new station was to launch a 28 kilogram or 61 pound amateur radio satellite from the trash airlock. This was hailed by the Soviets as the first launch of a communications satellite from a manned space vehicle, before NASA's planned launch of 2 heavy geostationary satellites from the shuttle later that year. Despite a successful first year, research on Salyut 7 was soon stalled by technical issues. In September 1983, a fuel leak was discovered after almost a whole tank vented into space. In a series of spacewalks, cosmonauts conducted 2 in-orbit repairs, and a later repair with a special tool delivered by Ground Resupply. The unprecedented scale of these repairs was impressive, but Salyut 7 faced a much greater challenge ahead. In 1984, Salyut 7's third cosmonaut crew returned from orbit aboard Soyuz, and the space station entered autopilot mode, monitored by remote control from the Soviet ground team. On the 11th of February 1985, telemetry reported a huge electrical surge, knocking out the radio transmission from Salyut. When ground operators attempted to bring the transmitters back online, a second surge swept through the station, knocking out the radio receivers as well. Now, suddenly, Salyut 7 was out of contact, with no way of diagnosing what may have gone wrong. For months in 1985, the 16-metre or 50-foot long station drifted, silent and out of control. According to a Russian documentary program made in 2012, the Americans considered trying to capture the Salyut 7 with the space shuttle's cargo bay and bring it back to Earth. In reality, Soviet ground control had considered doing the same thing with the unfinished Buran shuttle, but they had found it would have been impossible. Although the Salyut couldn't be scooped up and carried back to Earth, it was far too valuable to just be abandoned. Instead, the only solution was to send up a Soyuz with a 2-man crew, consisting of Vladimir Dzhanibekov and Viktor Savinik, to manually dock with Salyut 7 and attempt a rescue. The first problem was, how do you dock with a dead space station that uses an automatic powered docking system? The engineers had to come up with an entirely new set of docking techniques. The Soyuz was a 3-man craft, but with just 2 crew, the third seat and the automatic docking system removed completely, there was enough room for extra supplies, food and water, and more fuel for the extended mission. The Soyuz was fitted with a laser rangefinder, and the crew took night vision goggles in case they had to dock on the night side. With a 70 to 80% chance of success, the mission was given the go-ahead. On the 6th of June 1985, the rescue mission launched and orbited for 2 days until it caught up with Salyut 7. As the Soyuz approached more closely, it appeared that the solar panels were misaligned. That meant that the electrical systems had failed completely. Using the laser rangefinder to align with the docking port, the crew matched the rotation of their craft to the salute and then approached slowly to contact and dock. This was a major achievement, but significant danger lay ahead. Neither the crew nor the ground control knew what had caused the station to go dark or what lay in wait for them inside. As the cosmonauts opened up the hatches to equalize the air pressure with the station, they felt a rush of freezing air. With Salute's power being offline for so long, it had been exposed to temperatures it had never been designed to operate in. Critical provisions like water were all frozen, and any number of essential life support systems might have been damaged. Ground control weren't even sure if it was safe for the crew to be on board. Dressed in winter clothing, the cosmonauts slowly went through the process of opening the 3 hatches that stood between them and the dark living area of the station. With handheld air quality tests, they quickly checked for carbon monoxide and other dangerous gases that could indicate a fire on board. The problems of the station were electrical in nature, but they couldn't just hotwire the station to the Soyuz. The fault that took down the space station could also blow the electrics in the Soyuz, and then they would be stranded and face almost certain death. Although the air supply was safe, they were limited to just 1 crew member at a time working in the station, because with no circulation systems working, the carbon dioxide from the crew member's own breath could build up to dangerous levels. So 1 crew member stayed in the Soyuz to monitor the other one working in the station. Water was also a problem. The crew had 8 days supply in the Soyuz. If they rationed it and tapped into the Salute's emergency supply, it would stretch to 12 days. But it could take that time or longer to find the cause of the problem and get the station's systems back online. If the water ran out before then, they would have to leave come what may.